Hey everyone, yeah, I'm Nikola, I'm from Croatia, and I'm technically a freelancer, but when I work with a client, I try to stay with them for as long as possible. So for the past year and a half or so, I've been working at B7 Labs. And I started out as a backend developer in Elixir, but I quickly changed roles to sort of a more full stack developer, which is probably why I think this topic is important and why I chose it to talk about. So end-to-end testing, and when I say end-to-end testing, I mean like full proper end-to-end testing where you like have user interaction, you simulate that, and it goes all the way to the database. I think it's very useful. I'm sure most of you agree. I think even like with full coverage, with integration unit tests, you still don't have the confidence level you would get with proper end-to-end coverage. So in Elixir and Phoenix, this is like, in principle, it's sort of easy to do. You have tools like Hound and Wallaby, which work right out of the box. They let you control the browser, and they give you access to the Ecto Sandbox like you would have in an integration or a unit test. So it's easy to set up that. All tests run in isolation from each other. And yeah, it's quite easy to set up. But there is an asterisk up there. Once you grow your front end in complexity a bit, you tend to encounter issues with selecting and interacting just because JavaScript is involved. So you have to write your own helpers and all that stuff. And yeah, it still sort of works, but you have to fight with it a bit. And in addition to that, like Hound, for example, isn't as maintained anymore as it used to be. So your options are sort of limited. And like that still sort of works, but the question is, what if the front end somehow makes it hard? So the video I hope you were seeing, I'm not sure if it was going correctly, shows the app, the project we're currently working on. It's heavy on front-end UI. It has some complex UI elements, some complex interactions, and it runs multiple things, multiple moving parts at the same time to get it to work. So of course, we run it in a separate repository. So that's one of the cases where it's problematic to use something like Hound and Wallaby when the front end is separate, external, so to say. It could be even a desktop app or a CLI application or something like that, where it's really not possible to do end-to-end through the browser. So what do we do then? Like, wouldn't it be, no, let's not get ahead of ourselves. So what I've been encountering and what the basic scenarios to handle this are something like setting up your test data via a seed and then running the front end with the back end running using some sort of front end test runner suite. And then you run those tests, and after it's done, you reset the database. And that works great until you like increase your app complexity, until you add more tests, and then now your seed script needs to accommodate all of them, and it basically becomes impossible to handle. And then you end up with scenario number 2, which is basically you need to define different seeding scripts and expose ways to run those scripts automatically from your test suite. And then you split your tests into groups based on those seed scripts, and you sort of make it easier to manage that way. And again, that works, and it like moves the wall where you get stuck at forward quite a bit, but it still becomes more and more complex and more difficult to handle. So it is an option, but it ends up very often being a pain to the point where a lot of things just don't use it and like even forego end-to-end tests in general. So wouldn't it be great if we could basically get the Ecto Sandbox benefits everywhere, like even with an external front end, external client? How would we do that? Well, the thing is, and this is, I had a lightning talk at a recent code-beam conference about it, but it's already built in. I'm not sure why most people don't know about it. Well, most people I spoke with, but if you go to this link, you don't have to type it in now, but you can Google the module name later. And you scroll down, you can see a small section called concurrent end-to-end tests with external clients. And it basically tells you that you can get an Ecto Sandbox session from any external client. And it's very easy, actually. So this is a plug. And all you have to do is add this snippet to somewhere within your like endpoint. The recommended place is actually in the endpoint module before everything else. And what you get with it is a couple of things. The first thing you get is a post endpoint to the location you specify using the @ option, which is when you hit this endpoint with a post request, the system Ecto will check out a Sandbox session for you, and it will return the ID for it. And then you're expected to add this ID to the header of all of your other requests that you would run in your test. The default key for that header is user agent, and initially I wasn't sure why that is. While I was working on this, I got an idea that I haven't tried out yet, but I'll mention it later. And so I wasn't sure why it was, so I tend to replace it with Sandbox ID or something just to make it more explicit. And you can specify a timeout like you would in like a data case test in Phoenix, Elixir. I'm not sure where you get that data case module. So that's like the 15 seconds. You're probably going to end up increasing that, at least initially, because it's a bit slow, a bit short for some of the more complex texts you might write. But yeah, this gives you a Sandbox session. And then you get a delete endpoint, which when you hit it with a request that has that Sandbox ID in the header, the session is checked back in. And that gives you like a full Sandbox session with a start and an end. And the third thing you get is sort of like proxy-like behavior for the rest of your backend. So this plug will read all requests coming from the client, check for the presence of a Sandbox ID header, and if present, it'll take the ID and allow the process that's handling that request into the Sandbox. So with this, you basically get the same environment you would in an integration test or in a unit test even, or in an end-to-end test using Hound or Wallaby. They basically do this just within Elixir. So you have this. How do you use it? I'm guessing most of you have an idea, but yeah, let's just go through it quickly anyway. Like before every test, you check out a Sandbox, then you run some code that adds this Sandbox as a header to all your subsequent requests. You run your test, which now runs in isolation. And after it's done, you check in the Sandbox, and that basically resets the database for you. And that works great. Sounds easy, right? But depending on the framework you're using, there could be some caveats, some tricks involved. So I guess the real goal here is, since this is like supported out of the box, is to figure out what the tricks are. Maybe while we're at it, improve like our testing environment a bit. So what are the tricks? Well, checking in the Sandbox and checking it out, that's easy. Like any framework I've ever used allows you to fire a network request to the backend, right? So not a problem. The problem is how do you add it to all your subsequent requests? So we need to like differentiate two things here. One is requests made from the client, like from the browser that is being controlled by the test, which involves somehow modifying the client in some way. And the other is requests you might make as part of the setup process for a test, which run from the test suite directly. Like the second one, the second category is easy again, because you're just basically modifying requests directly. The first one is tricky. And the way I've tackled this in the past is, and while writing examples that I'm going to show after this, is basically to ask a couple of questions about the tool set I'm using. So the first question I would go with is to ask, does the framework support some sort of way to intercept requests made by the client, like by the browser that's being controlled? Cypress and Testcafe support this. Those are two of the examples I'm going to show. So when you get that, it's relatively easy. You just add this interception feature and you add a header to all requests coming from the client before passing them on. So no problem there. If that doesn't work, then there are some problems, but we still have solutions for them. One question that's good to ask is if the client can, if the test runner can execute JS code in the client somehow, ideally like before anything else happens in the client. If that's the case, then you get a clean way to do it by, well, cleanish, by figuring out what the request library or API the client is using. For example, if it's using window fetch, to stop that library and make it so it adds a header to all requests from that point on. So basically you would override window fetch with a custom function that calls window fetch, but before it does that, it adds the header to the options. If that doesn't work, then the other approach that might work and usually does is to check if the test runner can add a cookie or a local storage key value into the client browser. If that's the case, then you need to, it's a bit dirtier to implement, but it's easier to do, in my opinion. You basically add the session ID as a cookie or as a local storage key, and then expose a way in the app itself to read that key and add it to all requests. You could hide that behind an environment flag, for example, to make it cleanish, like to make sure that this code at least doesn't run in staging in production. But it is an option. So those are the methods I've tried and they're proven to work. One thing that I sort of got the idea that might work and would explain why the default key for the plug is user agent is if the browser, or sorry, if the test runner could somehow dynamically alter the browser's user agent string. If you can do that, then you can add a session ID that way, and then like you don't need to change the defaults for the plug. Well, you don't need to do it anyway. As I said, I do it for preference, but that would be one way to do it then. But rather than just talking about it, maybe I should show you some examples about it. So bear with me, I need to change my share for a moment. Oh, I think I should share my entire screen, but I'm not sure how to do that. Any tips? I don't have an option to share my entire screen. Oh, here it is. Sorry, it was me. I hope everyone can see this, but yeah, I'm currently, I have a repository open with examples. I'm gonna share a link after at the last slide, but here's me. Well, first, let's just run tests written in Phoenix with Wallaby. Hold on. I'm hoping this will work okay. My connection tends to not be the greatest, but it's just a couple of tests. And as I said, they're written in Wallaby. It's just basic interaction, log in, register, and it's a to-do list. So creating to-dos, deleting to-dos, all that stuff. This here, it's not stock. It just has a wait period for some reason. Yeah, those were Phoenix tests. So to compare, let's go with Vue first, just because it's closest to home. I'm working with Vue on the front end, and I've worked with Cypress, which is the test framework Vue uses by default with its CLI utilities before. So let's do that. So it's quite similar, except I need to run them manually because I'm in user interaction mode. Hold on, needs to load up. Okay, so running all the specs. I did not expect full screen here. So just to take the opportunity to plug it here, I really love Cypress. If you haven't used it before, I recommend you try it. It has this great interface where you can sort of rewind the testing scenario to see what happened and basically check everything. So that works great. But you can't spend too long in it because there's a Sandbox timeout. So if it times out, you're going to get errors in the next test. But yeah, that was Vue with Cypress. So next up is React with Testcafe. And I need to, my commands aren't perfect, so I had to abort here. React. So again, same suite of tests, just written in a different framework, and takes a bit to run, but here it is. Oh, and sorry about the log output. I'm basically running the backend, the front end, and the test suite in the same tab, so that's why it's spamming a bit. I'm sure there are ways to clean that up a bit. Yeah, that was React, and the last one is Angular with Protractor, which I have zero experience with except for writing this example. So if I did anything wrong, I'll show the code later. Please be kind. But yeah, that one I had some difficulties with because it doesn't support proxying or request intercepting. So I had to go with the cookie approach. And some other difficulties, like it was updating Chrome on every run. So I had some conflicts there. But overall, it wasn't too hard to implement. Again, same approach, same set of tests, just achieved a bit differently. So those were the tests. I think next up would be a good idea to show you how I did it in code. So let me just get that Zoom dropdown, which won't open now. Hold on. Sharing my code screen. And sorry about switching back and forth. I'm on one screen, so I have to like switch windows just to get it working. I think my VS Code is visible. Is it? Can anyone confirm?
It is.
Okay. So first off, let's go with Phoenix. Like so, same order as I ran the tests in. As I said, Phoenix is using Wallaby, so this is like we're not doing the external client approach, but I wanted to just show it for comparison. One mistake I made was I called the application in Phoenix E2E. So I couldn't call the test folder E2E because by default you have the E2E folder for other tests. So yeah, it's called acceptance. I think it's a valid term for end-to-end tests. So yeah, let me show you the login test. So basically, Wallaby gives you this new thing called feature, a macro that replaces test, and it sets up the sandbox for you. Sorry about the traffic. So it sets up the sandbox for you as the usual data case setup would. So basically, sorry, support. Yeah. It does this, and it also sets up the browser session for you, and it gives you the session ID object or whatever. And the test is simple, like you insert your data, you navigate, you make interactions, and you make assertions. And that's how you do it basically anywhere. But yeah, as you can see, works pretty much out of the box, no additional setup needed. You just include the necessary modules and that's about it. So here's how I did it in Vue. Now, Cypress does this weird thing that I'm not sure I like the syntax of it, but it basically exposes a global object. And then you get a set of default commands for it, which are chainable and denable and all that stuff. And you get to implement custom commands. So what I did here was I implemented a bunch of custom commands. One is for checking out the sandbox, one for checking it in, and one is basically the factory command, so to say. So the thing that creates the data. All of them are promise-like, but in a format that Cypress supports, so you can chain them and all that fun stuff. But yeah, this is how the command is implemented. So the syntax might not be the clearest, but the approach should be. This is how you define the request interceptor. So basically it's called a server command, and you tell it that on any request, it needs to add a sandbox ID if present in the environment. And then outside of that, like this adds the interceptor, and then this makes a request to the sandbox endpoint. And then it stores the sandbox ID into the environment. So like this runs immediately before tests, and this also runs immediately, but it tells the system to do this on every request. And yeah, that's about it. That's all it took to get Cypress working with it. Check-in is a bit simpler. You just send a request to the delete endpoint. And then there's a create command, which basically sends another request to a special endpoint that I've implemented on backend for factory methods. So basically to easily create data. And I also have a logging command, but that's not really, you can look at it later, but it's basically to speed up some of the tests and to make, like, repeat myself less. So that was Vue and Cypress. React and Testcafe are similar in approach, different in syntax. So if we go here, they call them fixtures here. Let's look at the equivalent login fixture. So we have a fixture definition. We have a before each, where we initialize a sandbox and create a factory. And then after each, we check in a sandbox. So that's about the same. The test runs identically. You create your data, you run interactions, you make assertions. And the way the sandbox is implemented is, again, as I said before, Testcafe also supports request intercepting. So what I do is I, again, post to sandbox, get back an ID, create a new request hook, which is the approach Testcafe defines for request intercepting, and tell it to, on every request, add a header sandbox ID. That's about it. Check-in does the same thing in reverse. And yeah, as I said, the approach is the same, just different syntax. And now Angular, as I said, I keep repeating that, runs a bit differently. Rather than doing it through interceptors, which as far as I could tell is not possible. Apparently it's not possible to the point where it won't be possible in the foreseeable future. That was my understanding of it. But what I did because of that is I used the cookie approach. It was the easiest to do. So let's find ourselves a test. Where are we? Oh, wrong folder. E2E. Oh, so I'm using the page model approach here, which is basically an object that defines all of your selectors. Since it's a simple app, it's a single object for the entire app, and it lets me sort of navigate through the DOM a bit more easily. But yeah, that's this, and I'm using that here. Again, login. Before every test, we init sandbox, create factory, initialize the page model, and after we, during the test, we set up our data, do like interaction, and make assertions. So same as before, just again, different syntax. And then sandbox initialization is now different. What we do is again post to the same sandbox endpoint, but this time we need to, well, first we need to fetch a URL by the browser, so it's sort of instantiated. And then when we do that, we add a cookie to the browser, which then I have to access in actual app code. Oh, collapsed too much. So here in the API module, I basically initialize an Axios client, which gets the sandbox cookie, and if present, adds it as a header. So like, I'm not doing that here, but in an actual application, I would probably hide this behind an environment flag. So at least it's not present in production or staging code. So it's only available in test and maybe development if necessary. But yeah, that's it's not the cleanest approach, but it was the easiest to do here. So what the other approach that I could have done was to let's go back to the helper. So rather than doing this, to run some JavaScript in the browser, which I know replaces window.fetch and makes it so a header is added to all fetch requests. It's cleaner, but it's, in my experience, more prone to failures. And like, depending on which library you use to make requests, it might internally, I don't know, handle sort of compatibility issues, fallback. So like it might have a polyfill for fetch or something like that, where it's not always clear which thing is going to get called to make a request. So the cookie is less clean probably, but easier to manage and easier to achieve, in my opinion. And the last option I mentioned is mocking the user agent string, which might be an option with Protractor. It's sort of hinted that it is, but I haven't really taken the time to check. So that's next on my agenda. But yeah, I think those are all the examples. So I'm switching my share back to the slides. Hold on. I think I did it. I think we did figure out the tricks. So the next thing I wanted to do is find ways to improve the test environment, test scenario. So I wrote a couple of examples here, and every time I did a new one, I was encountering the same issue. Same here as well as in my previous projects and all that. One thing I usually have an issue starting off is that the plug that Phoenix Ecto provides, it checks out the sandbox if the header is present, but if it's not, it just lets the request through. So what happens is if you're still hooking things up on the front end, some requests might go through and they might persist data into your database. So then you have to manually reset it, and it just wastes time for you, and it's not a great experience. So what I tend to do immediately upon activating this is I add another plug, which basically blocks all requests that don't have a sandbox ID, except the one for like creating the sandbox session, or maybe a few other requests that I know have to go through for some other reason. That reduces the amount of issues I have, reduces the amount of times I need to reset, and just speeds up development for me. And the biggest thing I probably do, I always do, and probably the biggest thing I can do is find a way to facilitate creation of test data. So like this whole approach, this thing I mentioned, the basic steps give you an isolated test, but they don't really give you an easy way to create data like you would in a backend test, in an integration test, or in an end-to-end backend test. So what I tend to do is, because in most of my projects on the backend, I use Ex Machina as a factory library to easily create data in tests. I just expose an endpoint or two for Ex Machina, which basically allows me to call Ex Machina insert from the front end. So basically it's an endpoint. Well, really there are two endpoints, an insert endpoint and an insert list endpoint, which accept a schema name and a set of attributes, and in the case of the list endpoint, a count, and that creates data for me on the backend. Now, a small issue here might be, what do you return to the front end when that happens? So for example, if you're using Phoenix and you're using the JSON library, you could, I don't know, implement protocols for all your schemas. But if you don't want to do that, there's little sense to do it just for tests. So in most cases, just sending back the ID of the record being created should be enough. If you're identifying your records by some other thing, then like it could be a slug or something. But for the most part, you don't have to like render everything into JSON to return it. So that's the biggest thing I recommend doing, basically exposing an easy way to create data. And like the two minor things that I tend to do is like to run these tests. As you saw, I was running them with a single command. But generally to run them, you have to start your backend in test mode. Then you have to start your front end, and then you run your test suite. So that's like 3 processes you need to run every time you want to try something out. Now the backend and the front end might have library load enabled, so you don't have to like restart it every time. And some test frameworks on the front end allow you to specify how to run the front end app, so it's managed for you, but you still need to run at minimum 2 processes plus any other service or something you might need. So I tend to like write a hack command that just runs them all at once and cleans up after. It just helps for quick local tests, so to say. And one thing I did for the purposes of this talk in these examples is I tried to figure out how to do this in continuous integration. And I went with GitHub just because, GitHub Actions, just because I didn't have to do like any third-party stuff. And I managed to find a way to run all of these tests, plus backend integration tests, plus Credo, Dialyzer, and all the linting in a single workflow within, like they run in about 5 minutes. So like that's GitHub Actions. I would like to do it in other continuous integration environments too. I think what makes the most sense next is probably Circle, since the syntax is similar. But yeah, the more the merrier. So I'll try to do more. But yeah, I think that's about it. We figure out how to do it. We figure out how we could improve it. And I guess now, like, this slide is what I would love to have, like sort of what my dreams are about it. So I did introduce you to the concept, I hope, even though like there's documentation on it and it's supposed to be like well known. So I'm not sure why it isn't. What I would like to see is for it to be a bit more popular, because every time I mention it, I have yet to find someone who is using it other than the teams I work with. There's a blog article out there that mentions it briefly, but that's about it in my experience. So I want to make it more popular. So maybe this talk will help. Maybe when this is uploaded somewhere, that'll help too. And what I would love is to like have an actual recipe book, a repository or a knowledge base on how one would do this with most of the popular frameworks out there. Doing it with a desktop application or with a CLI application would be great too. So yeah, again, the more of this stuff can be known, the better for everyone. And like the last thing I would love to have is to maybe get some tools created, which when I have the time, I'll try, but no promises and no obligations. If anyone else is interested, feel free. But basically, when doing these examples and in previous projects, I keep encountering the same patterns. So the plug that prevents other requests, I always use. The plug for Ex Machina endpoints, I also always use. So those could easily be libraries or additions or something. The front-end code for factory access, again, is something I do in pretty much the same way every time. I guess Cypress, the way it's done in Cypress could be extracted. The way it's done in Testcafe could be extracted. We could have generators that do it. There's a lot of stuff that could be done here that would be great. But yeah, we all know how contributions to these things work. And I believe Martin said yesterday that you do your project until you can do a talk about it, and then you abandon it. I promise I won't do that, but at least in the foreseeable future. But yeah, I don't know what will happen. But I think that's about it. I'm not sure how long it took. Probably less than I thought it would. But yeah, any questions? Oh, and the repository with these examples is at this link. This is a QR code that will take you to it, and you can contact me through these. So any questions?
First, applause. Thank you very, very much. This is really cool stuff, and I think you're onto something important here, and you're starting to see the patterns, and you're conveying it in a really, really good way here. And I think the way to go is, of course, what you're doing now, talking about it, writing about it, sharing it. So thank you for bringing it to the community. Let's see if we have some questions. Looking at Hoover now. No questions as of yet. So I suggest, I mean, people can turn on their cameras, turn on their microphone, and ask questions. Or if you prefer to write them down in the Hoover app in the session Q&A tab, that's perfectly okay as well. We have 5 minutes for Q&A. And perhaps I can start by asking a question. I mean, I'm curious, could you elaborate a bit on this create tool? So you say something more what you have in mind there?
Well, basically, the biggest thing I'm thinking of is if we could have generators for like a generator for Testcafe that sets up everything for you, for example. because the basic approach is about the same, and like it could even be something as a small library which just gets you the before and after functions that handle this for you. So hook things up for you. So it's configurable. You let it know which endpoint you used on the back end to add the plug, and it just works for you. Just so someone else doesn't have to figure it out. So there's that. There's as I said, the option of automatically providing the endpoints for Ex Machina for data creation, or some other, I don't know. Ex Machina is the only factory library I use on the backend. I'm not sure if there are others in Elixir. Similarly on the front end, so basically a library that hooks up to that backend would be welcome. But really, like, that's far off. The key thing here is maybe to expand the book of recipes, so to say, and to have a discussion on what the best approaches are. Just so, like, there's this is the way, this is the, I don't know, superior way of doing it, just so people don't make mistakes. And like, I've made a lot of mistakes trying this out on various frameworks, so it would be great if I could have avoided them. And there was no documentation about it. At some point, I even went to the Elixir Slack room and asked about a problem I was having trying to implement this, and the answer was basically that, like, they'd never heard of this and this is not possible. So even though it's documented in the library in Hexdocs. So yeah, it needs to be better known. That's first and foremost, and then it needs to be discussed. And if that happens, then we can think about libraries, because like the boilerplate here in this case isn't that big. It's doable.
Thank you. So we have a question from Sui Abraham. Can this end-to-end test with external clients be extended to Absinthe GraphQL?
I've actually used it with Absinthe in a React project with an Elixir backend, but that was years ago. It was working, but the problem I was encountering was, well, I was going with the overwrite window fetch approach. And that doesn't work great with Absinthe because it, as far as I know, it does like this fallback system where if window fetch is available, it uses that, then it goes to XHR and other things. So like it wasn't 100% reliable. I had to, like, in the test environment, explicitly disable window fetch and just mock XHR. But it's absolutely doable. I would just probably go with the cookie approach rather than this approach I did. It seems easier and more reliable that way.